Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and one of the last things we do when we make a quilt is put the binding on. And I'd like to share with you today my favorite technique on sewing on the binding. I have my quilt top all quilted and ready to go, and my binding is cut, pressed, and stitched together. I do have a video on my favorite way of making binding, and I'll put a link in the description if you'd like to check it out. When I do sew my binding together, I like to use a 45-degree angle. Press that seam open and then press those raw edges together so that the good side of the fabric is on the outside. I do like to cut my binding at 2 1/4 of an inch. Now there are many ways you can stop and start binding, but I'm going to share with you today my favorite way. The way I like to start my binding is with a point at the very end. So I'm going to take the one edge and fold it so it matches up on the bottom. This is going to eventually be pressed back over, but I don't need all of this fabric there. So I'm going to trim off a little bit of this point so I have less fabric. And I don't measure, I just cut off that point. And just to hold that down better, I do run a little bit of a fabric glue, and this glue will wash off. Now I can refold it so that the raw edges are together, and I can set all of those seams. If those raw edges are facing you, your point is going to be on the right-hand side. And the reason is we're going to pick this up and sew it on the quilt in this position. And that's the way it's going to want to fit under the machine. So if I'm sewing down in this direction, my point is coming up first. You will see this little opening and that seam allowance inside that binding. If you're not looking at the seam allowance, we've pressed the point going in the wrong direction. This little point is all that needs to be done in order for my binding to be sewn on. But I do like to mark the corners of my quilts. What I'm looking for is the center point. And since my corner is a 45-degree angle, I'm going to be able to mark it with a ruler with a 45-degree angle. Lay the quilt down, run that 45-degree angle along one edge of the quilt, getting right to that point, and then mark that point. So this is the middle line from that point. With those 4 corners marked and my point pressed, I'm ready to go to the machine. At the machine, I've pinned down my 2 points, and that way the foot doesn't accidentally lift up those points. I'm going to start stitching off of this point, come on, and keep going. But from this point to this point, I want to do less than 1/4 of an inch. So I can do somewhere about 1/8 of an inch. When we get all the way around and come back to this point, we're going to stitch a true 1/4 inch so that less than 1/4 inch will be hidden underneath. I start sewing off of that point, take the pin off when I come really close, and then continue stitching to just a little bit past this point. And remove the pin. Now I'm going to reset the machine to the 1/4 inch. Put the needle up and then put the needle back down, and it's going to move it over into the right position. I'm going to stitch that 1/4 inch following that edge, stopping at about 1 inch to 2 inches from this point. And just stitch. I will often wear a quilting glove on my left hand. That just allows me to grip my quilt better as I'm going around. But I leave my right hand without a glove so that I can work my thread better. This just makes it a lot easier for me to grip. Keep stitching till you get to that point. I want to transfer this corner mark on the quilt to the binding. So the line is exactly the same underneath. I'm going to continue stitching a 1/4 inch until I come right to this line. And then I'm going to come off of the quilt. So I'm stitching right to the line and then turn the body of the quilt so you're just stitching off. And I leave my thread attached. Having this thread attached means I'm going to be able to use it as a helping hand. We need to match up this raw edge along the raw edge of the quilt. And we're going to need to make a little angle up at the top. You can always put a little pin right in where you continued that drawing line. Just lift up this corner and swing that binding over. This little fold in the top will need to match this top edge. So we can just adjust that. And with that pin there, you're not going to be able to pull too much fabric. So those raw edges match up. The pin has kept my angle, and that fold is right along that top. You can always put a pin in to hold that position. I have that thread still attached, and it's sort of like a handle. So I can guide that fabric towards the back of the machine. I will need to stitch along this edge, but I do want to start outside, go over that hump, and then stitch the 1/4 inch. And this thread is going to help me do that. I like to place my needle down and then slide that right up to the needle. This gives me a chance to guide it into the right position. Have the needle touch the edge of the quilt and pull slightly with this thread. Just a very slight tug is going to help that needle and that foot get over that larger hump. And continue sewing that 1/4 inch. Keep all of the raw edges together and use the edge of the foot as a guide. You're going to do this to all 4 corners. As you pull this thread back to help you get over the hump, you just need a very gentle tug. It's more of tension than a tug. We stitch all the way around until we come really close to our beginning. And we'll need to trim off this binding. And I want to trim the binding in this area. So I just take a peek underneath and with a pair of scissors, cut that binding in an angle. So there's enough fabric to cover that edge, but I'm going to be able to take that point and stick it inside. And a stiletto or a little point of the scissors will help you feed that right in. Those 2 folds should match right up once this is tucked inside. The quilt is flat and both of those bindings are flat. We can continue stitching a 1/4 inch and we're going to stitch right past that 1/8 of an inch that we did. And keep stitching until you come right in line with your 1/4 inch seam. And just keep stitching. And then eventually you will line up to your 1/4 inch seam. And then just stitch right off the binding. Just put a pin in to hold those layers together. There's one extra stitch that we can do to hold these layers down. Fold the binding over, just stitch a little bit right there along that edge. It's just going to be a basting stitch. So that little bit of machine basting is just going to hold those layers together until I can get to do the hand sewing. As for these helping hand threads, I trim and leave a nice big tail. I'm going to start sewing the binding on by closing off this opening. Start with my thread and knot in the back so the needle is coming right out of that edge. And I'm going to close off this seam. My sewing needle is going to catch a little bit of that seam, take a little stitch into the back, come up through that fold, go beside the fold, and then come right back up on that fold. So I'm going on the fold, off the fold, up, on the fold, off the fold, up, on, off. So I'm making these tiny little stitches running along the edge. When I come right to that point, I'm going to go in, which will form a loop. And just put my needle through that loop and make a knot. And even though I've made a knot, I'm going to use this thread to continue stitching. But I can now remove this basting stitch. And that now looks like a finished mitered seam. Now I'm going to be able to work from the back. I have that already knotted and ready to go. So I can just roll over my binding, do a second knot so that the knot is going into the back of the quilt. There are a few different ways you can hand sew this. I like to sew with my back facing up. Another way is that the quilt is up, but you're turning it this way. We want to stitch that fold onto the back of the quilt. The stitch I use to stitch down this binding is the same that I use to close off that seam. I'm going to run my needle along the inside of the quilt, come up and just pick up a little bit of that fold. Put that needle right back into the quilt back, run it along the edge, and pick up the fold. Let me show you with a darker thread. I'm going to run the needle through the back of the quilt. And at the same time, I'm going to catch that fold. So it's only a little piece of that fold. Where I came out, I want to go back in, right beside there. Run the needle along the back. And when you come up, just pick up a little bit of that fold. So you will have these tiny little stitches. As we stitch and get to this corner, we need to turn this corner into a mitered corner so that it looks the same as the front. But we do want to keep the bulk down, so we want the mitered corner to go in the opposite direction as the front. For example, when we're looking at the front, the fold is going in one direction. We want the fold going in the opposite direction on the back side. The fold is going in this direction for the top. When we turn it over, the fold is going in this direction. That means we have more fabric here on the one side and the extra fabric here on the second side. That fold now is a nice 45-degree angle. We're going to be able to continue stitching, do 1 or 2 stitches along this edge, and then continue stitching down. And we're going to do all 4 corners the same way. And of course, you will be using matching thread. So I machine stitch that binding on the front of the quilt, and I take that beginning and the ending of the binding and I slide them together so I don't have to take the quilt off the machine to finish that binding. I can just keep stitching and go right off the end. To me, finishing the binding on a quilt is like finishing a good book. I do enjoy that final chapter. And since it's the last time I'm going to work on the quilt, I do try to enjoy it. There are times when, of course, we are happy to see it done, and other times I'm sort of happy to see it done. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.